By 8 o'clock that morning, nearly every worker on the farm had gathered behind the equipment barn. In the center of the muddy yard sat a faded red tractor that had not moved in almost 3 months. Rain had dulled its paint, weeds had begun curling around the rear tires, and a thin spiderweb stretched across the exhaust pipe. Richard Hale stood several feet away with his arms folded. Beside him were 3 mechanics who had already spent weeks trying to repair the machine. They had replaced the fuel filters, inspected the injectors, removed the fuel pump, installed a new battery, and tested nearly every electrical connection they could reach. The repair bills had climbed into the thousands. The tractor still ran for a short time, lost power, and died. Richard had not gathered everyone because he believed the machine could be saved. He had gathered them because Elias Cooper had claimed he knew what was wrong. The old farmer entered the yard carrying an old pair of pliers, a stained cloth, and a thin piece of wire curled inside his shirt pocket. One of the mechanics looked at the tools and laughed. "You planning to rebuild the engine with that?" Elias did not answer. He walked slowly around the tractor without lifting the hood. He studied the fuel lines, pressed one hand against the side of the tank, and examined the fuel cap. Richard was already losing patience. "You said you could fix it." Elias kept his eyes on the tractor. "I said I knew why it stopped." Richard pointed toward the mechanics. "These men checked everything. The pump is fine. The injectors are fine. The battery is new. There is no electrical fault." Elias finally looked at him. "And yet it still does not run." No one answered. Elias asked one of the workers to climb into the seat and start the engine. The starter turned several times before the diesel caught. At first, the engine coughed unevenly. Then the rhythm settled into a heavy, steady idle. One of the mechanics shrugged. "It always starts. That is not the problem." Elias nodded. "Let it run." 5 minutes passed. The engine sounded normal. After 10 minutes, the rhythm began to change. The revolutions dipped slightly, recovered, and dipped again. Elias stood still, listening. A mechanic stepped toward the hood, but Elias raised one hand. "Do not touch it." A few minutes later, the tractor began to shake. The engine missed one beat, then another, as if someone were slowly closing a valve somewhere inside the fuel system. Richard checked his watch. "That is exactly what it always does." Elias moved closer, but he still did not open the hood. Instead, he leaned toward the fuel tank and listened. The engine weakened again. The exhaust became uneven. Then the tractor died. Silence settled over the yard. One mechanic spoke immediately. "The pump is losing pressure. I told you the whole unit needs to be replaced." Elias did not argue. He placed one hand on the fuel cap and slowly began to turn it. The moment the cap loosened, a faint hiss escaped. Air rushed into the tank. The sound lasted less than 2 seconds, but Elias stopped moving. He looked at Richard. "Did you hear that?" Richard frowned. "Hear what?" Elias removed the cap and turned it over in his palm. Then he took the thin wire from his pocket and straightened one end. The oldest mechanic stepped closer. "What are you doing?" Elias pointed toward a tiny opening near the edge of the cap. "How many parts did you replace?" "The parts that needed replacing." "Did anyone inspect this?" The mechanic leaned in. The opening was so small that it was almost invisible. Dust, old paint, and greasy residue had sealed it shut. Elias pushed the wire into the hole. It would not pass through. He twisted it gently. A small piece of black dirt dropped into his palm. No one laughed this time. Elias wiped the cap clean with the cloth, blew through the opening, and screwed it back onto the tank. Richard stared at him. "That is it?" Elias returned the wire to his pocket. "Now we find out." He climbed into the seat and turned the key. The tractor started immediately. Richard showed no emotion. The machine had restarted many times before. Elias let it idle for several minutes. Then he shifted into gear and drove out of the yard toward the eastern field. 10 minutes passed. The tractor kept moving. 20 minutes. The engine remained steady. After 30 minutes, Elias turned the tractor around and drove back toward the barn. There was no hesitation in the engine, no fading power, and no sign that it was about to die. He stopped directly in front of Richard but left the engine running. One of the mechanics stepped forward, placed a hand against the engine housing, and checked the fuel pressure gauge. Everything remained stable. Richard looked at the tractor, then at the thin wire sticking out of Elias's pocket. All of this because of one tiny hole? Elias shut off the engine. The yard became quiet again, but this time no one doubted the tractor would start. Elias climbed down and handed the fuel cap to Richard. The tractor did not need more parts. He pressed one finger against the small opening he had cleared. It needed air. Richard stared at the cap in his hand. He still did not understand how something so small had fooled 3 mechanics, wasted thousands of dollars, and turned a working tractor into a machine abandoned in the rain. Elias began walking away. Before leaving the yard, he stopped and looked back. "You listened to the engine," he said. "But none of you listened to the tank." Richard remained beside the tractor, holding the cheapest part on the entire machine. For the first time that morning, he had nothing to say. 6 months earlier, Richard Hale bought the farm with one clear intention: turn it into the most modern operation in the county. He replaced fences, renovated the barns, and ordered newer equipment. But behind an old storage shed, he found a faded red tractor that had belonged to the previous owner. The machine was nearly 50 years old. Its paint was dull, its seat was torn, and rust covered parts of the hood. Richard's farm manager, Daniel Price, told him the tractor was no longer needed. "We already have better machines," Daniel said. Richard walked around the tractor. The newer equipment was stronger and more efficient, but none of it looked like this. The old tractor carried the image Richard wanted for the farm: tradition, strength, and history. "Restore it," Richard said. "For field work? For everything." The tractor was sent to a restoration shop. 5 weeks later, it returned with fresh red paint, polished metal, a new seat, and clean tires. The engine had been serviced, the filters had been replaced, and the fuel system had been checked. Richard was pleased with how it looked. He was less interested in how it had been tested. The tractor had only been run briefly inside the workshop. No one had operated it long enough for the hidden problem to appear. Elias Cooper watched from the neighboring field as the restored machine was unloaded. He had known that tractor for years. The previous owner had used it for plowing, hauling feed, and cutting hay. Elias recognized its engine before he could clearly see its red hood. Richard noticed him standing near the fence. "Looks different now, doesn't it?" Richard called. Elias examined the tractor from a distance. "It looks cleaner." It was completely restored. Elias looked at the fresh paint around the fuel tank and the newly coated fuel cap. Did they work it after they restored it? They tested it. For how long? Richard frowned. Long enough. Elias did not argue. He returned to repairing his fence. Richard saw the silence as disrespect. A week later, he organized a demonstration for several investors and local officials. The restored tractor would pull a wagon through the main field, while Richard explained how he was combining old farming traditions with modern management. The event began exactly as planned. Richard climbed into the seat and started the engine. The diesel fired immediately. The tractor moved across the field with a steady rumble. Guests watched from beside the barn while cameras followed the bright red machine. For the first 10 minutes, nothing went wrong. Then Richard felt the engine hesitate. The tractor lost power for less than a second before recovering. He looked at the gauges. Oil pressure was normal. Engine temperature was normal. The fuel tank was more than half full. Richard continued driving. A minute later, the engine weakened again. This time, the loss of power lasted longer. Daniel noticed the change in sound and walked toward the edge of the field. Richard pushed the throttle forward. The engine responded briefly, then began to stumble. Its rhythm became uneven, as though fuel were reaching the cylinders in smaller and smaller amounts. The tractor slowed. Richard pressed the throttle again. Nothing changed. The engine coughed twice and died. The machine stopped in the center of the field. Richard tried the starter. The engine turned but did not fire. He tried again with the same result. Daniel reached the tractor and opened the hood. "What happened?" Richard asked. "Could be a fuel restriction. The system was just serviced." Daniel checked the filter and several fuel connections. Everything appeared normal. After 10 minutes, he tried the ignition. The engine started. Richard looked at him. "So it is fixed?" "I did not fix anything." Richard did not like that answer. He drove the tractor back toward the barn. It completed the short trip without another failure. By the time the guests left, Richard had convinced himself the problem had been minor. Elias had heard the engine die from the neighboring field. That evening, he found Daniel inspecting the tractor near the barn. "Did it stop suddenly?" Elias asked. Daniel looked up. "No, it lost power first." "How long had it been running?" "Maybe 15 minutes." And it started again after sitting? Daniel nodded. Elias looked toward the fuel tank. Then the engine may not be broken. Daniel followed his eyes. What do you think it is? Elias did not answer directly. Run it tomorrow. Do not touch anything when it begins to die. Listen to how it happens. Richard approached before Daniel could ask another question. We have trained mechanics for this, he said. Elias turned toward him. Then they should find it. Richard heard doubt in his voice. They will. Elias looked once more at the tractor. The expensive failures are usually easy to believe, he said. It is the small ones people refuse to see. He walked back toward his property. The next morning the tractor started normally. It ran for 18 minutes. Then it lost power and died again. The tractor failed again the next morning. Daniel had let it idle beside the barn while he checked the hydraulic system. For the first 15 minutes the engine ran normally. Then the revolutions began to drop. The engine recovered once, stumbled again, and slowly died. Daniel checked the time. 18 minutes. Almost exactly the same as the day before. He waited 10 minutes and turned the key. The tractor started. That pattern should have mattered. Instead, Richard called a diesel repair company. 2 mechanics arrived that afternoon with pressure gauges, electrical testers, and a service truck full of replacement parts. Richard met them beside the tractor. I want the problem solved, he said, not temporarily patched. The lead mechanic, Curtis Webb, asked Daniel to describe the failure. It runs for 15 to 20 minutes, Daniel said. Then it loses power gradually and dies. After sitting, it starts again. Curtis nodded. Fuel delivery problem. Elias had been right about that much, but Curtis immediately focused on the most expensive parts of the system. He opened the hood and connected a pressure gauge near the injection pump. He inspected the fuel lines, removed the filter, and checked for water or dirt. The filter was clean. The lines showed no visible leaks. The pump worked normally while the engine was cold. Curtis started the tractor and watched the gauge. For several minutes the reading remained steady. Richard stood nearby, waiting for a clear answer. After 17 minutes the engine began to weaken. The fuel pressure dropped. There, Curtis said. The pump is failing when it gets warm. Daniel looked at the gauge. Could something before the pump be restricting the fuel? Curtis shook his head. If the tank or line were blocked, the problem would be constant. But the restriction was not constant. It became worse only after the engine had drawn fuel from the sealed tank long enough to create a vacuum. No one checked the cap. Curtis shut down the test. The pump should be rebuilt. I would replace the supply hose and filter assembly at the same time. Richard did not ask whether there was a simpler test. How soon? We can have the parts tomorrow. Do it. The repair took most of the next day. The mechanics installed a rebuilt pump, replaced the supply hose, fitted another filter, and bled the air from the fuel system. When they finished, the tractor started immediately. Curtis increased the throttle. The engine sounded stronger. Richard smiled. What caused it? The old pump was not maintaining pressure. Daniel looked at the removed pump lying on the workbench. It showed wear, but nothing that clearly explained why the tractor always restarted after resting. How long did you test it? He asked. 10 minutes. Daniel looked toward the fuel tank. That may not be long enough. Richard heard him. They replaced the faulty part. We do not know that yet. Richard's expression hardened. We hired experts. Let them do their work. Daniel said nothing more. The following morning, Richard decided to test the tractor himself. He drove it toward the northern pasture with a mower attached behind it. For the first 10 minutes, the machine worked perfectly. At 15 minutes, the engine hesitated. Richard felt the same brief loss of power beneath his feet. He pushed the throttle forward. The tractor continued for another 100 yards. Then the engine began to starve. The sound weakened slowly, exactly as it had before the new pump was installed. Richard turned toward the barn, but the tractor did not make it. It stopped near the fence. He tried the ignition. The engine turned without starting. Richard struck the steering wheel with his palm. The rebuilt pump had changed nothing. Elias was repairing a water trough on the other side of the fence. He had heard the tractor begin to struggle before Richard reached the field's edge. He walked over but remained on his own side of the boundary. Same problem? He asked. Richard climbed down. The new pump must be defective. Elias looked at the tractor. Or the old pump was never the problem. Richard opened the hood even though he did not know what he was looking for. The pressure dropped. Because the pump was not receiving enough fuel. That is what the mechanics repaired. They repaired the part that moved the fuel. Elias glanced toward the tank. They did not ask why the fuel stopped reaching it. Richard closed the hood. You think you know more than they do? I think the tractor keeps giving the same answer. And what answer is that? Elias looked at his watch. How long did it run? About 18 minutes. How long before it starts again? Richard did not reply. Elias stepped closer to the fence. Do not replace anything else until you understand why time matters. Richard stared at him. The old farmer was not guessing about a random mechanical failure. He had noticed a pattern that the repair company had ignored, but Richard was not ready to admit it. He called Curtis and demanded another inspection. By the time the mechanics returned, the tractor had been sitting for 20 minutes. Curtis climbed into the seat and turned the key. The engine started immediately. He looked at Richard. The pump is working. Then why did it stop? Curtis studied the gauges. We will need to inspect the injectors. Elias turned away from the fence. Richard heard him say one sentence before he walked back toward his trough. You are still looking downstream. Richard watched him leave, then authorized the next repair. Curtis returned the next morning with 2 mechanics and a set of rebuilt injectors. He still believed the problem was somewhere inside the fuel system. Since the pump had already been replaced, the injectors became the next suspect. Richard approved the repair without hesitation. I do not care what it costs, he said. I want the tractor working. Daniel stood beside the workbench as the mechanics removed the old injectors. Did you test the fuel flow from the tank? He asked. Curtis pointed toward the new supply hose. The line is clear. That is not what I asked. Curtis looked at him. The pressure drops before the engine dies. We are correcting the most likely causes. Daniel checked his notebook. The tractor had failed 3 times. Each time, it had run between 17 and 19 minutes. Each time, it had restarted after sitting. The exact pattern made a damaged injector less likely, but Richard had already made his decision. The mechanics installed the rebuilt injectors and adjusted the fuel system. By early afternoon, the tractor was ready. Curtis started the engine. It idled smoothly. He increased the throttle several times. The response was sharp, and there was no unusual smoke from the exhaust. Richard looked at Daniel. That sounds fixed. Daniel checked the time. Let it run. 10 minutes passed. The engine remained steady. Curtis began packing his tools. At 16 minutes, the tractor hesitated. Daniel immediately looked up. At 17 minutes, the engine lost power. Curtis stopped packing. The tractor continued running, but the sound became weaker with every second. At 18 minutes, it died. No one spoke. Richard stared at the machine. The injectors are new. Curtis opened the hood. They may not be the problem. Richard's face tightened. You told me they were. I said they were the next likely cause. Daniel stepped forward. The pump was not the cause. The injectors are not the cause. The engine keeps starving after the same amount of time. Curtis checked the filter housing and the supply line. Both were still full of fuel. He loosened one connection near the pump. Only a small amount of diesel came out. The flow is restricted somewhere, he said. Daniel looked toward the tank. Then start there. Curtis followed his eyes but did not touch the fuel cap. Instead, he crawled beneath the tractor and inspected the shutoff valve and the line leaving the bottom of the tank. Richard waited beside the hood. What are you looking for? Rust in the tank, debris around the outlet, possibly a damaged pickup tube. Can you repair it? We may need to drain and remove the tank. Richard nodded. Do it. Daniel closed his notebook. We have not proven the tank needs to be removed. Richard turned toward him. You wanted them to inspect the tank. I wanted them to test the full fuel path before replacing more parts. They are testing it now, after replacing the pump and injectors. Richard stepped closer. Do you have a better diagnosis? Daniel glanced toward the western fence. Elias stood on the other side, watching the tractor. He had heard the engine weaken and die again. Richard noticed him too. This has nothing to do with that old man, he said. Daniel lowered his voice. He identified the pattern before any of us did. He has not repaired anything. He has not been allowed near the machine. Richard walked toward the fence. Elias remained where he was. They replaced the injectors, Richard said. Elias looked at the silent tractor. And it still stopped. The tank may have rust inside it. Maybe. Richard waited for more. Elias pointed toward the tractor. Did anyone change the test? Richard frowned. What test? They start it. They wait. It dies. Then they replace something. They are eliminating possible causes. They are replacing parts while repeating the same mistake. Richard's voice hardened. If you know what is wrong, say it. Elias looked at Curtis, who was still examining the outlet beneath the tank. Your mechanics are checking where the fuel comes out. That is where a blockage would be. Sometimes the problem is not that fuel cannot get out. Richard waited. Elias did not finish the explanation. Instead, he asked, what happens every time the tractor sits? It starts again. And what changes while it sits? Richard had no answer. Elias turned back toward his field. Richard called after him. You enjoy making this sound like a riddle. Elias stopped. No, I am trying to make you observe before you spend. Richard looked toward the mechanics. Remove the tank, he ordered. The fuel was drained. The tank was lifted from the tractor and inspected. There was no heavy rust. The outlet was clear. The pickup tube was intact. The mechanics flushed the tank anyway and reinstalled it before sunset. The tractor started. It ran for 19 minutes. Then it died again. Richard stood beside the silent machine while Curtis reviewed the work already completed. New fuel filter, new supply hose, rebuilt pump, rebuilt injectors, clean fuel tank. The same failure remained. Curtis wiped his hands. The next step is a complete engine inspection. Daniel looked at him. The engine is not losing compression and recovering 20 minutes later. Curtis did not reply. Richard looked at the tractor, then at the growing stack of invoices on the workbench. For the first time, the cost was no longer the only problem. Every failed repair made Elias's warning harder to ignore. The tractor did not need another expensive part. Someone had failed to understand what happened during those 18 minutes. The next morning, Curtis returned to inspect the engine. By then, Richard had spent thousands of dollars replacing parts that had not solved the failure. He no longer wanted another theory. He wanted proof. Curtis began with a compression test. If the valves, pistons, or cylinder walls were damaged, the readings would reveal it. All cylinders were within the normal range. He checked the valve clearances. Nothing was wrong. He inspected the oil for metal particles, tested the electrical system, and examined the exhaust for signs of internal damage. Every result pointed to the same conclusion. The engine itself was healthy. Richard stood beside the tractor. Then explain why it keeps dying. Curtis removed his gloves. We know the fuel pressure falls before the engine stops. You replaced the pump. Yes. And the injectors. Yes. You cleaned the tank and changed the lines. Curtis did not answer. Richard stepped closer. So either every new part you installed is defective, or you never understood the problem. Daniel opened his notebook. The engine always runs normally when it starts. It does not overheat. It does not lose compression. It only weakens after fuel has been drawn from the tank for a certain amount of time. Curtis looked toward the tractor. There could still be an intermittent restriction. Where? Richard asked. Curtis hesitated. That hesitation ended the conversation. Richard told the mechanics to pack their tools. I am not paying for another part until someone can prove it is broken. Curtis did not argue. His team loaded the service truck and left the farm. Richard remained in the yard with Daniel. The tractor sat between them. Its hood was open. Several new components shone beneath it, but the machine was no more reliable than before the repairs began. Daniel closed the hood. We should change the way we test it. Richard looked at him. What do you suggest? Run it until it begins to fail. Then interrupt the pattern. How? Open the fuel system at different points. Find where the flow stops. Richard immediately understood where the idea had come from. You have been talking to Elias. He asked the right question. He has offered no proof. Neither did the people we paid. Richard turned away. He was no longer defending the mechanics. He was defending his own decisions. That afternoon, he ordered Daniel to run one final test. The tractor was connected to a mower and driven into the lower pasture. Richard followed in a utility vehicle while Daniel watched the time. At 12 minutes, the tractor was still operating normally. At 16 minutes, the engine hesitated. At 17, the power began to fade. Daniel raised one hand. Stop here. Richard climbed down from the utility vehicle. Daniel opened the hood and checked the line entering the injection pump. Fuel flow was weak. He moved back along the supply line. There was no leak. The filter remained clean. The outlet beneath the tank was not blocked. The engine continued struggling. Daniel reached for the fuel cap. Richard stopped him. "What are you doing?" "Testing whether the tank is pulling air." The tank was removed and cleaned. "That does not mean it is venting." Before Daniel could touch the cap, the engine died. Richard looked at the silent tractor. Daniel pointed toward the tank. "Let me open it." Richard shook his head. "We have already inspected that tank. We inspected the inside. We did not test what happens while the tractor is running." Richard stared at the cap. For a moment, he seemed ready to agree. Then he looked toward the western fence. Elias was standing near a gate, watching them. Richard's expression changed. He stepped back from the tractor. "No, I am done chasing guesses. This is a simple test. That is what everyone said before every repair." Daniel lowered his voice. "We do not need to replace anything. We only need to open the cap." Richard heard how small the test sounded. That made it harder for him to accept. If Daniel was right, then the rebuilt pump, the injectors, the new lines, and the tank removal had all been unnecessary. The problem would not be the machine. It would be the refusal to check something simple. Richard climbed into the utility vehicle. "Tow it back." Daniel looked at the fuel cap one last time. 20 minutes later, the tractor was parked behind the equipment barn. After sitting, it started normally again. Richard shut it off before anyone could continue testing. "Move it out of sight," he said. Daniel did not argue this time. The tractor was pushed behind the old storage shed, where rainwater collected in the tire tracks and weeds grew along the wall. The machine had not been condemned because its engine was destroyed. It had been abandoned because Richard no longer wanted to be reminded that he had failed to understand it. From across the fence, Elias watched the tractor disappear behind the shed. He had heard enough. The engine had never been the problem. The missing clue was still sitting on top of the fuel tank. The red tractor remained behind the storage shed for 3 weeks. Richard replaced it with a new machine and ordered the workers not to waste any more time on the old one. But the tractor still had to be moved. Its position blocked access to the rear equipment yard, where a delivery truck was scheduled to unload fencing materials. Daniel asked a young worker named Noah to drive it 50 yards to an empty section near the boundary fence. Noah checked the fuel level and turned the key. The engine started immediately. He looked toward Daniel. "I thought this thing was dead." "It starts," Daniel said. "It just does not stay running." Noah drove slowly across the yard. The tractor reached the new parking area without trouble. Since the engine still sounded normal, Noah left it running while Daniel directed the delivery truck. 15 minutes later, the engine began to weaken. Noah pushed the throttle forward. The tractor responded for a moment, then lost power again. Daniel heard the change and walked toward it. "Do not shut it off," he said. The engine stumbled. Daniel moved directly toward the fuel cap. Before he could reach it, Richard stepped out of the equipment barn. "What are you doing?" "Testing the tank vent. We are finished testing that machine. It is failing right now. This is the best time to check it." Richard looked at the workers nearby. He did not want another public attempt, followed by another failure. "The tractor is being sold." Daniel paused. "To whom?" "A salvage dealer." Noah looked down from the seat. "It runs too well to scrap." Richard ignored him. "The dealer is collecting it Friday." Daniel placed one hand on the fuel tank. "Give me 30 seconds." "No." The engine coughed twice and stopped. Daniel kept his hand near the cap. Richard pointed toward the barn. "Leave it where it is." He walked away before Daniel could answer. On the other side of the fence, Elias had heard the entire exchange. Later that afternoon, he found Daniel checking the tractor alone. "You almost opened the cap," Elias said. Daniel looked toward Richard's office before answering. "He stopped me." "Why?" "Because if the problem is simple, every repair he approved becomes harder to explain." Elias walked closer to the fence. "Did the tank outlet stay clear?" "Yes." "Did the fuel pressure fall gradually?" "Yes." "And after the tractor sits, it starts again?" "Every time." Elias nodded toward the cap. "Then open it the next time it dies." Daniel lowered his voice. "You already know what we will hear. I know what I expect to hear. A vacuum. Possibly." Daniel looked at the tractor. "If the vent is blocked, air cannot replace the fuel leaving the tank. The pump keeps pulling. Pressure inside the tank falls, until the fuel flow slows enough to starve the engine." Daniel removed his cap and rubbed his forehead. "We replaced the pump because the pressure dropped." "The gauge showed the result," Elias said. Not the cause. Daniel looked toward the small fuel cap. Why would the vent suddenly block after restoration? Fresh paint, polishing compound, dirt pushed into a hole no one noticed. Daniel studied the cap more carefully. A thin layer of new red paint covered its outer surface. Near the edge was a small dark mark, almost hidden beneath dried residue. He reached toward it. Richard's voice came from behind them. "I told you to leave that machine alone." Daniel withdrew his hand. Elias remained beside the fence. Richard looked at him. "This is private property. I am standing on mine. You have been interfering with my employees." "I answered a question." Richard turned to Daniel. "The salvage dealer arrives Friday morning. Until then, no one touches the tractor." Daniel looked at the machine, then at the cap. "We may be throwing away a working tractor. We are removing an unreliable machine. The engine is healthy. It does not matter. A machine that cannot finish a job has no value here." Elias spoke calmly. "Only if the machine is the thing that failed." Richard faced him. "You have criticized every repair without doing anything yourself. You never allowed me to." Richard stepped closer to the fence. "Then let us settle it." Elias waited. "The dealer comes Friday at 9, Richard said. "You have one attempt before he loads it." Daniel looked at Richard in surprise. Richard continued. "No replacement parts. No dismantling the engine. No delay." Elias nodded. "I will not need any of those. And when it dies again, you stop telling my workers that everyone else is wrong." Elias looked at the tractor. "When it runs, how long must it stay running before you admit the problem is fixed?" Richard answered immediately. 1 hour under load." "Agreed." Richard walked back toward his office. Daniel waited until he was out of hearing range. "What will you bring?" Elias looked at the fuel cap. A pair of pliers. He touched the thin wire holding the fence beside him, and something small enough to clear a hole everyone else was too busy to see. The tractor remained beside the fence until Friday morning. A white salvage truck arrived at 9. So did the mechanics Richard had previously dismissed. Richard wanted witnesses. Elias entered the yard carrying an old cloth, a pair of pliers, and a short piece of wire. This time, no one laughed immediately, but no one believed the tractor would still be running an hour later. At 9 o'clock Friday morning, the salvage truck stopped beside the equipment barn. Richard had invited Curtis and the other mechanics to return. Daniel stood near the tractor with several farm workers. Everyone knew the terms. Elias had one attempt. The tractor had to run under load for 1 full hour. If it failed, the salvage dealer would take it away. Elias walked into the yard carrying only a pair of pliers, an old cloth, and a short piece of wire. Curtis looked at the tools. "That is all you brought?" "That is all I need." Richard pointed toward the tractor. "No speeches. Show us." Elias did not approach the engine. He first asked Daniel a question. "How long has it been sitting?" "Since Tuesday." "Then it will start." Elias climbed into the seat and turned the key. The engine fired immediately. Curtis folded his arms. "We already know it starts." Elias looked down at him. "Today you are going to watch why it stops." He connected a mower to the rear of the tractor and drove into the lower field. Daniel started a timer. For the first 10 minutes, the tractor worked normally. The mower cut a clean path through the grass, and the engine maintained a steady rhythm. At 15 minutes, Elias felt the first hesitation. He continued driving. At 17 minutes, the engine lost power again. The men near the barn heard the change. Richard looked at Daniel's timer. Same as before. Elias turned the tractor back toward the group. By the time he reached the yard, the engine was struggling. Each combustion cycle sounded weaker than the last. He stopped beside them but did not shut the engine off. "Watch the pressure gauge," Elias said. Curtis looked at the reading. "It is dropping. That is why you replaced the pump." "Yes." Elias stepped down while the engine continued to stumble. "And did the new pump stop the pressure from dropping?" Curtis did not answer. Elias placed his hand on the fuel cap. Richard watched closely. "You think the cap caused all of this?" "I think the engine is using fuel faster than the tank can replace it with air." The tractor coughed. Elias slowly loosened the cap. A sharp hiss came from the tank. Air rushed inward. Everyone heard it. Within seconds, the engine began to recover. The uneven rhythm steadied. The fuel pressure gauge climbed back toward normal. Curtis stepped closer. "Open it again." Elias loosened the cap another turn. The engine returned to a strong idle. Daniel stopped the timer. 18 minutes and 41 seconds. The tractor had reached the exact point where it usually died. This time, opening the cap had prevented it. Richard stared at the running engine. "What does that prove?" "That fuel can leave the tank," Elias said, "but air cannot enter it." He shut off the tractor and removed the cap. Near the edge was a tiny vent hole, almost hidden beneath paint and oily dirt. Elias held it toward Curtis. "This hole allows air into the tank as fuel leaves." Curtis examined it. "It is blocked. When the pump pulls fuel out, the empty space must be replaced by air," Elias said. "If air cannot enter, pressure inside the tank falls. The pump keeps pulling until the vacuum becomes stronger than the fuel flow." Daniel nodded. "That is why the pressure dropped before the engine stopped." "And why the tractor restarted after sitting," Elias continued. Air slowly leaked back into the tank and equalized the pressure. Curtis looked at the parts they had previously replaced. The pump was showing the symptom, not causing it. Elias pushed the wire into the vent hole. It stopped against the blockage. He twisted it gently until a hard piece of dried paint and grease broke free. Then he wiped the cap clean and blew through the opening. Air passed through easily. He handed the cap to Curtis. "Check it." Curtis blew through it and felt the airflow on the other side. The vent was open. Elias screwed the cap back onto the tank. Richard looked at the piece of dirt in Elias's palm. "That stopped the entire tractor?" "That stopped the fuel from reaching the engine." Richard glanced at the salvage truck. "Run it." Elias started the tractor again and returned to the field. Daniel reset the timer. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. At the 30-minute mark, the engine showed no loss of power. Curtis watched the pressure gauge from the tractor's side step. The reading remained stable. 45 minutes passed. The mower continued cutting through the field. At 1 hour, Elias completed another row and drove back toward the barn. He stopped in front of Richard. The engine was still running. Daniel showed him the timer. 1 hour and 3 minutes. Elias shut off the tractor. Richard looked at Curtis. "You replaced the pump." Curtis lowered his eyes. "The pressure was dropping." "You replaced the injectors. We followed the fuel system. You removed the tank. We were looking for a blockage." Elias held up the fuel cap. "The blockage was here." Richard looked at the wire in Elias's other hand. "How much would that repair have cost?" Elias placed the cap on the hood. "Nothing. If someone had listened before replacing parts." The salvage dealer closed the door of his truck. "I assume I am not taking the tractor." Richard did not answer immediately. He looked at the restored machine, the mechanics, and the old farmer who had solved the problem without opening the hood. Finally, he shook his head. "The tractor stays." The dealer drove away empty. Elias began walking toward the gate. Richard called after him. "Where are you going?" "The machine is fixed." Richard looked at the tractor. "What do I owe you?" Elias stopped. "You already paid for the lesson." Then he left the yard while the red tractor remained beside the barn, ready to work for the first time in months. The next morning, Richard ordered every repair invoice placed on his desk: the rebuilt pump, the new injectors, the replacement fuel lines, the second filter assembly, the labor required to remove and clean the tank. None of those repairs had solved the problem. Daniel added the figures together. Richard looked at the total. Thousands of dollars had been spent because no one had checked a blocked vent hole. Curtis returned to collect several tools his crew had left behind. Richard met him beside the tractor. The red machine had already been working for 2 hours without losing power. Richard handed him the invoices. "How did 3 mechanics miss the cap?" Curtis looked toward the fuel tank. "We followed the pressure drop. You followed it to the pump." "That was the most likely failure, but not the actual one." Curtis had no defense. The gauge had shown falling fuel pressure, but it had not explained why the pressure fell. They had replaced the component affected by the restriction instead of finding the source of it. Richard looked at the tractor. "What should you have done?" Curtis answered carefully. "Tested fuel flow from the tank while the failure was happening, and opened the cap." "Yes." Richard dismissed the remaining charges connected to the unnecessary work. Curtis accepted the decision and left without argument. Daniel stayed behind. Richard placed the fuel cap on his desk beside the invoices. "I saw a pressure problem," he said. "They saw a pump problem." "Elias saw a timing pattern," Daniel replied. Richard looked at him. "You tried to open the cap, twice, and I stopped you." Daniel did not answer. Richard knew the truth. The tractor had remained broken because he had preferred an expensive explanation over a simple one. Each repair made him more determined to prove the previous decision correct. He had not been protecting the machine. He had been protecting his pride. Later that morning, Richard walked across the western pasture toward Elias's farm. Elias was repairing a gate hinge beside his barn. He did not stop working when Richard approached. "The tractor ran all morning," Richard said. "It should." Richard held out an envelope. Inside was more money than the repair could reasonably have cost. Elias looked at it but did not take it. "I cleared a hole. You saved the tractor." The tractor did not need saving. It needed a proper diagnosis. Richard lowered the envelope. "Then take it for the diagnosis." Elias tightened the final bolt on the hinge. "No." Richard was not accustomed to having money refused. "What do you want?" Elias stood and wiped his hands on a cloth. "Next time one of your workers notices something, let him finish the test." Richard understood the reference. Daniel. He was closer to the answer than the mechanics because he watched the pattern. Richard looked toward Hale Valley Farm. "I thought experience meant having the best equipment and hiring the best people." "Experience means knowing which detail matters." Richard put the envelope back into his coat. "Come work for me." Elias shook his head. "I have my own farm." "Then advise us." "You do not need another consultant." "What do I need?" "A rule." That afternoon, Richard gathered Daniel, the equipment crew, and the farm workers inside the repair barn. The red tractor stood behind them. On the workbench were the replaced pump, the rebuilt injectors, and the fuel cap Elias had cleared. Richard picked up the cap. This stopped the tractor. Several workers leaned closer. He pointed toward the tiny vent. The engine was healthy. The pump was working. The injectors were working. But this hole was blocked, and we replaced everything except the cause. He placed the cap beside the expensive parts. "From now on, no part is replaced until the failure is reproduced and the cause is proven." Daniel added a second rule to the maintenance board. "Observe the pattern before choosing the repair." Richard looked toward Elias, who stood near the barn entrance. "Anything else?" Elias pointed at the cap. "Start with the simplest system that could create the symptom." Daniel wrote that beneath the first rule. A young mechanic picked up the old pump. "So these parts were never broken?" "They were worn," Elias said. "But worn is not the same as failed." The distinction silenced the room. Richard had treated every imperfect part as proof. Elias had separated normal wear from the fault that actually stopped the machine. Before the workers returned to their jobs, Richard removed the salvage tag still tied to the tractor's steering column. He placed it beside the invoices. The tag had been attached when he believed the machine had no value. Now it represented how close he had come to throwing away a working tractor because he refused to question his own decisions. Richard turned to Elias. "I should have listened the first time." Elias looked at the machine. "You should have listened to the tractor." Richard nodded. For once he did not argue. That afternoon the red tractor returned to the lower field. It worked until sunset without missing a single beat. 2 months later, another machine stopped in the north field. This time, it was one of Richard's newest tractors. The engine lost power while pulling a loaded trailer. A warning light appeared on the dashboard, and the operator shut it down immediately. By the time Richard arrived, 2 workers had already opened the hood. One pointed toward the fuel system. "It may be the lift pump." The other shook his head. "The computer shows low rail pressure. It could be the injectors." Richard looked at the machine. A few months earlier, he would have called the dealer and approved whatever repair sounded most complete. Instead, he asked one question. "What happened before it stopped?" The operator answered. "It ran normally until we reached the hill. Then it lost power." "Did it stop suddenly?" "No. It weakened." "Did any warning appear before the pressure light?" The fuel level warning flashed once. Richard checked the gauge. It showed nearly half a tank. Daniel arrived with the maintenance log. "The tractor was fueled yesterday." Richard did not order anyone to replace a part. "Reproduce the failure," he said. "Then prove where the fuel stops." The workers exchanged glances. Richard pointed toward the hood. "No guessing. No parts until we understand the pattern." Daniel climbed into the cab and started the engine. It idled normally. They drove the tractor toward the same hill with the trailer still attached. Halfway up, the engine began losing power. Daniel stopped before it died. The workers checked the fuel supply line. Flow was weak. They opened the tank. The fuel level was much lower than the dashboard indicated. A bent float arm had jammed the gauge near the halfway mark. The tractor had not suffered a pump failure. It had nearly run out of fuel. One worker looked embarrassed. "We almost ordered a new pump." Richard looked at the gauge, then at the machine. "Because the warning pointed toward the fuel system," Daniel nodded. "But the warning did not tell us why." Richard recognized the words. He had heard the same lesson beside the old red tractor. A symptom was not a cause. The tank was filled, the float mechanism was repaired, and the tractor returned to work that afternoon. No expensive components were replaced. Later, Richard entered the equipment barn. The old fuel cap from the red tractor was mounted above the maintenance board. Beneath it were the 2 rules Elias had given them. Observe the pattern before choosing the repair. Start with the simplest system that could create the symptom. Richard added a 3rd line. A reading can show where the failure appears. It cannot always show where the failure begins. Elias entered the barn while Richard was writing. "I heard about the new tractor," he said. Richard placed the marker down. "We almost replaced another pump, but you did not." "No." Elias looked at the new rule. "What changed?" Richard glanced toward the red tractor working beyond the open barn doors. "I stopped trying to prove the first answer was right." Elias nodded. "That saves more machines than any tool." Richard walked to the shelf and picked up the thin piece of wire Elias had used to clear the blocked vent. He had cleaned it and placed it beside the old repair invoices. "I used to think the lesson was that an old farmer knew more than 3 mechanics." Elias waited. Richard continued. "That was not the lesson." "What was?" "That everyone was looking for something expensive enough to match the size of the failure." Elias looked toward the field. "And the tractor?" "It only needed air." For a moment, neither man spoke. Outside, the restored red tractor crossed the lower pasture with a trailer of feed behind it. Its engine held a steady rhythm as it climbed the same slope where it had once died. Richard watched until it disappeared behind the barn. Then he turned back to the workers. "Before you replace anything," he said, "tell me what the machine is actually doing." No one laughed at the rule. Not anymore. Above them, the old fuel cap remained fixed to the wall. The cheapest part on the tractor had become the most valuable lesson on the farm. At the end of the season, Richard held a small gathering inside the equipment barn. There were no investors, reporters, or photographers. Only the farm workers, Daniel, several local mechanics, and Elias. The red tractor stood at the center of the barn. It had worked through the entire harvest without another failure. Richard walked to the workbench and picked up the old fuel cap. A few months earlier, he had treated it as an insignificant part. Now it was mounted on a wooden board beside the thin wire Elias had used to clear the vent. Richard faced the group. "When this tractor first failed, I believed the size of the problem had to match the size of the machine." He pointed toward the replaced pump and injectors displayed on the bench. "So we searched for an expensive failure." No one spoke. "We had gauges, new parts, trained mechanics, and more money than patience." Richard looked at Elias. "But the one man we ignored asked the simplest questions. How long did the tractor run? Did it lose power suddenly or gradually? Why did it start again after sitting? What changed during those 18 minutes? Richard turned back to the workers. "We did not fail because we lacked equipment. We failed because we stopped observing." Curtis, the mechanic who had replaced the pump, stood near the rear of the group. Richard had invited him deliberately. He did not want the lesson to become an attack on mechanics or modern tools. "The pressure gauge was correct," Richard continued. "Fuel pressure was falling, but the gauge showed where the problem appeared, not where it began." Curtis nodded. "We treated the reading as the diagnosis." Elias spoke from beside the tractor. "A tool can tell you what changed. It cannot always tell you why." A young worker looked at the mounted fuel cap. "So how do we avoid making the same mistake?" Elias answered without hesitation. "Start with the pattern." He raised one finger. "What happens?" "A second." "When does it happen?" "A third." "What changes when the machine begins working again?" Daniel wrote the questions on the maintenance board. Elias continued. "Then check the simple systems before opening the expensive ones." Richard looked around the barn. "That is the new rule here." He turned the wooden board around. Beneath the fuel cap, a metal plate carried a short inscription. "Respect your elders. Their experience was paid for before you arrived." Elias read the words and frowned slightly. "You make it sound like old people are always right." A few workers laughed. Richard smiled. Aren't they? No. Elias pointed toward the tractor. Age does not make a man right. Paying attention does. The laughter stopped. Elias walked to the board and tapped the fuel cap. Experience is useful because it teaches you which questions are worth asking. But the moment an old man believes he cannot be wrong, he becomes just as dangerous as a rich man who believes he can buy every answer. Richard accepted the correction. Then what should the sign say? Elias thought for a moment. He picked up a marker and wrote beneath the metal plate, "Respect experience." Then verify it. Richard read the words. That is less dramatic. It is more useful. Daniel left both lines on the board. The following spring, the farm began a new maintenance program. Young workers learned how to use diagnostic computers, pressure gauges, and electrical testers. But they also learned to record the exact behavior of every failure before replacing a part. They listened for changes in engine rhythm. They checked whether problems appeared hot or cold. They noted whether machines failed under load or at idle. They tested the simplest explanation before accepting the most expensive one. Elias never took a formal position at the farm. He came only when someone asked a question worth answering. Sometimes he identified the problem immediately, sometimes he did not, but he always began the same way. Tell me exactly what the machine did. Richard stopped interrupting workers when their ideas sounded too simple. He also stopped believing that price and expertise were the same thing. The red tractor remained in daily use. Its paint collected scratches, mud covered its tires. The polished hood lost the perfect shine Richard had once valued. For the first time, it looked less like a symbol and more like a working machine. One evening, Richard and Elias stood near the barn as the tractor returned from the lower field. The engine held a steady diesel rhythm. Richard listened until it stopped beside them. I spent thousands trying to make that sound come back, he said. Elias looked at the fuel tank. No, you spent thousands because you were not listening when it disappeared. Richard nodded. He no longer heard the remark as an insult. It was simply the truth. The driver shut off the engine and climbed down. Before leaving, he inspected the fuel cap and checked the vent with a thin wire from the toolbox. Elias noticed. So they finally learned, Richard said. Elias watched the young worker return the wire to its place. They learned to look. The two men walked out of the barn together. Behind them, the red tractor waited for the next morning. It had never needed a new engine. It had never needed thousands of dollars in parts. It had needed one small opening, one careful observation, and one old farmer whom everyone had dismissed too quickly. 3 weeks later, Richard received a call from the regional equipment dealer. The company was organizing a maintenance workshop for local farm owners. Curtis had told them about the red tractor and the blocked fuel cap vent. They wanted Richard to present the case. Richard agreed on one condition. Elias would explain the diagnosis. When Richard delivered the invitation, Elias was repairing a fence post. I do not give speeches, Elias said. You do not need to. Just tell them what happened. They already know what happened. They know which part was blocked. They do not know why everyone missed it. Elias drove the post deeper into the ground. And you think I do? Richard nodded. Because we were trying to prove our own answers instead of studying the failure. Elias stopped working. That was the first time Richard had admitted it without defending himself. The workshop was held inside the dealer's service building. More than 40 farmers, operators, and mechanics gathered around the red tractor. Several recognized Elias. Most knew him only as an aging farmer who maintained old equipment with simple tools. Curtis began the presentation by describing the repairs his crew had performed. We replaced the pump because the pressure fell, he said. Then we replaced the injectors because the new pump did not solve the problem. He pointed toward the fuel tank. We followed the symptom downstream. Elias looked upstream. Richard stood beside the tractor. We spent thousands of dollars and nearly sold a working machine for scrap. He held up the fuel cap. This was the cause. A few people moved closer. Richard handed the cap to Elias. The room became quiet. Elias did not begin with the repair. He began with the pattern. The tractor always started cold, he said. It ran for almost the same amount of time, weakened gradually, and restarted after resting. He wrote 4 questions on a board. Did it fail suddenly or slowly? Did it fail cold or after running? Did it recover without a repair? What changed while it rested? Those questions reduced the possibilities, Elias said. A broken engine does not repair itself in 20 minutes. A damaged injector does not wait for the same amount of time before failing. But a sealed tank can build more vacuum every minute the engine draws fuel. A young mechanic raised his hand. The pressure gauge still showed a pump problem. It showed low pressure near the pump, Elias replied. That is not the same thing. He held up the cap. The gauge was correct. The conclusion was wrong. Curtis stepped forward. We should have opened the cap while the engine was failing. Yes. That single test would have prevented every unnecessary repair. Yes. Elias did not embarrass him further. Instead, he placed the cap on the tractor's hood. Modern tools are useful, but a tool should test an idea. It should not replace observation. Richard watched the mechanics take notes. Months earlier, he had dismissed the same words because they came from a man with no company uniform, certification badge, or diagnostic computer. Now an entire room was listening. After the workshop, the equipment dealer offered Elias a paid advisory position. He declined. Richard expected that answer. But Elias agreed to return once a month to review difficult cases with the younger mechanics. His only condition was simple. No one could tell him which part they planned to replace until they had first described exactly how the machine failed. Outside the building, Richard stopped beside the red tractor. You could have made them look foolish, he said. They already knew they were wrong. You could have reminded everyone that you were right. Elias closed the tractor's hood. Being right does not repair the next machine. Richard looked back through the workshop doors. Curtis was showing two apprentices how to test airflow through a fuel cap. The lesson had moved beyond Richard's farm. The old farmer they had ignored was now teaching the mechanics they had trusted. Richard held out the tractor key. You should drive it back. Elias shook his head. It is your tractor. Richard placed the key in his hand. But it is running because you listened when none of us did. Elias looked at the key, then climbed into the seat. The engine started on the first turn. Richard rode beside him on the fender as they left the service yard. For once, the millionaire was not giving directions. He was listening. By the end of harvest, the red tractor had worked more than 300 hours without another failure. Its paint was scratched again. Dust covered the hood, and mud had dried around the tires. Richard no longer kept it polished for photographs. It had become what it was meant to be, a working machine. One evening, Daniel parked it inside the equipment barn after the final load of hay had been moved. Richard entered a few minutes later and found Elias checking the fuel cap. You still do that every time? Richard asked. Not every time, Elias said. Only when I want it to keep working. He cleared a small trace of dust from the vent and tightened the cap. On the wall above the maintenance bench hung the old salvage tag. Beside it were the unnecessary repair invoices and the short piece of wire Elias had used that morning. Richard had kept them all, not as trophies, as reminders. Daniel entered with the season's maintenance report. Breakdowns are down, he said. Repair costs too. Richard looked through the pages. The difference did not come from buying more equipment. The workers had simply changed how they approached failure. They recorded when a problem appeared. They tested the simplest causes first. They stopped replacing parts until they could explain what had actually failed. Richard closed the report. All because of one blocked hole. Elias shook his head. No, the hole stopped the tractor. He pointed toward the invoices. This caused the expensive part. Richard understood. The real failure had not been inside the fuel tank. It had been the assumption that a large problem required a large repair. The next morning, Richard gathered the workers beside the tractor. He did not give a long speech. He held up the old fuel cap. We nearly sold this machine for scrap, he said. Not because it was broken beyond repair, but because we stopped asking the right questions. He placed the cap on the workbench. From now on, when a machine fails, no one begins with the most expensive explanation. One of the younger workers asked, Where do we begin? Richard looked toward Elias. The old farmer answered, With what changed? He pointed toward the tractor. Then ask what stayed the same. The worker nodded. And after that, listen before you take anything apart. That afternoon, the red tractor returned to the lower field. Richard drove it himself. Elias stood near the fence as the machine crossed the pasture. The engine held a steady rhythm, even when Richard climbed the long slope where it had once lost power. At the top, Richard stopped and looked back. Months earlier, he had seen the farm as something money could control. the best machines, the best specialists, the fastest answers. Now he understood that knowledge did not always arrive with new tools or expensive invoices. Sometimes it came from a man who had spent a lifetime watching small problems become large ones. Richard drove back toward the fence and stopped beside Elias. "The first time you heard it die, did you already know?" "I suspected. But you were not certain." "No." Richard looked at him. "Then why did you sound so confident?" Elias rested one hand on the fence. "Because I knew what to test. That was the difference. The mechanics had been certain about parts. Elias had been careful about evidence." Richard shifted the tractor into gear. Before driving away, he looked at the old farmer. "I should have respected your experience sooner." Elias nodded toward the fuel tank. "Respect it, but still check the cap." Richard smiled. Then he drove back into the field. The tractor continued until sunset without losing power. Its engine had never needed replacing. Its fuel pump had never been the true problem. The machine had only needed air through an opening no one considered important. And the millionaire had needed something just as simple, to stop proving he was right long enough to listen to someone who understood why he was wrong.